Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to our symposium about a new State Department policy planning staff paper called The Elements of the China Challenge. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Peter Berkowitz, the director of the policy planning staff, and Elbridge Colby, who is a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and a valued contributor to the National Interest. And both of them are going to discuss this paper today. The paper itself is 70 pages long. And my assumption is that much of the audience has not pored over it in detail. So I've asked Peter to begin by giving us an 8 to 10 minute introduction to the paper, and then Bridge will respond, and then I will ask a few questions. But my greatest hope is that you in the audience will submit some probing questions to our panelists. I anticipate a very interesting discussion on the elements of the China Challenge, and I'd like to welcome Peter now to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's good to be with you, good to be with Bridge, good to be with the audience. The essence of the China Challenge is easily stated. China is a great power. Like all great powers, China seeks eminence with preeminence within the established order. But distinctive to the People's Republic of China, governed by the Chinese Communist Party, China today seeks to transform the international order. That is the order established after World War II. The United States took the lead in establishing it. It's an order based on the principles of freedom, openness, and the rule of law. It's grounded in respect for human rights. China seeks to transform that order and to make the order, a new order, serve the Chinese Communist Party's authoritarian interests and aims. The challenge is easily stated. The elements take a little bit more work of the China Challenge. In the policy planning paper, we begin with explaining the break that the Trump administration effected with the conventional wisdom about China. For many decades, the United States, both right and left, have believed that after Deng's opening up of the Chinese economy in the late 1970s, that China would increasingly become, to use the stock phrase, a responsible stakeholder. That with economic liberalization in China, political liberalization would follow, and that the United States, other liberal democracies, could encourage that liberalization by engaging with China and welcoming China into international organizations. Especially the last decade has shown that those hopes were ill-founded. The Trump administration, beginning with the national security strategy of 2017, began to see China correctly, as China sees itself as a great power rival to the United States, which aims to transform the international order. The policy planning staff paper builds on the work of the Trump administration, both documents that articulate a strategy as well as policy of the Trump administration. We in policy planning, in accordance with our mandate, take a step back, take a longer range perspective, and attempt to see the challenge whole. We also attempt to sketch a framework for securing freedom. So what are the elements of China's conduct? We identify several. First, the Chinese Communist Party rules China in a dictatorial fashion that reflects Marxist-Leninist dogma of the 20th century practice. As I said, in China, you find a one-party repressive state. They've created a massive surveillance infrastructure in order to censor the people, in order to promulgate disinformation, in order to undertake schemes of ideological indoctrination. They repress religious and ethnic minorities, more than 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps in Xinjiang, 6 million Tibetans are repressed. Increasingly, ethnic Mongolians in Northeast China are subject to tighter sanctions, and some 70 million Christians in China face challenges in practicing their faith. In addition to dictatorship at home, Through brazen schemes of economic coercion and co-optation, China seeks to induce dependence in nations in all regions of the world. Moreover, China seeks to rewire international organizations from within, infusing them with Chinese, I should say, the CCP's authoritarian norms and standards. And not least, the Chinese Communist Party seeks to develop a world-class military that will equal and eventually surpass that of the United States. These are the elements of China's conduct. They form a worldwide pattern, but to understand the meaning of China's actions around the world, to acquire a full meaning of them, one also has to understand the ideas that inform China's conduct. By understanding these ideas, one gets a better understanding of communism, the Chinese Communist Party's understanding of China's place in the world, and the proper order. We argue in the policy planning staff paper that the Chinese Communist Party's sensibility is authoritarian, collectivist, and imperial, and it's nourished by two sets of ideas. One set of ideas I've already mentioned, conventional Marxism-Leninism, but then refracted through traditional Chinese notions. The second body of ideas is an extreme interpretation of Chinese nationalism. Much of the time, we are accustomed to thinking of communism, which envisages a worldwide society, universal society, and nationalism, which focuses on the interests, the cultures and traditions, and the political destiny of a single people. Most of the time, we're accustomed to think of nationalism and communism as conflicting schools. But the Chinese Communist Party reconciles these conflicting schools by understanding Chinese national rejuvenation to consist in not only repairing the state of the country after its century of humiliation, from the opium wars of the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, but also through attaining great power status and reorganizing the world, again, to reflect China's authoritarian norms. This is what Xi Jinping refers to frequently as the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation, which will receive expression in a community of common destiny for mankind. Now, we don't think that the ideas that inform China's conduct or China's conduct are somehow inevitable. They're not a reflection of the Chinese people. We distinguish the Chinese people, the people of China, from the Chinese Communist Party. They're a reflection of ideas embraced by the party. We know that the ideas are not inevitable because we can see in other areas in the region, people equally steeped in Confucian culture who have chosen freedom and democracy. The people of Hong Kong, though their freedom was crushed this spring by the Chinese Communist Party, the people of Taiwan have chosen freedom and democracy. The people of South Korea have chosen freedom and democracy. Maybe one day the people of China will too. Now, we also identify vulnerabilities that mark the regime of the Chinese Communist Party. Some of those vulnerabilities are endemic to all authoritarian governments. All authoritarian governments throughout history, I should say, generally and for the most part, authoritarian governments throughout history have shown difficulty in maintaining innovation and correcting for weaknesses over the long haul because of their suppression of dissent. Authoritarian governments throughout history have shown difficulty maintaining alliances, both because they're vicious and because they're untrustworthy. And over the long haul, authoritarian governments have had to expend great sums in repressing dissent at home. So these are general weaknesses associated with authoritarian governments. Of course, there are weaknesses that are specific to the Chinese Communist Party. Various forms of economic instability, beginning with the 600 million or so, yes, 600 million or so Chinese people who are still in a condition of, who still live as peasants on roughly 140 American dollars a month. There are the problems that grow out of, there are demographic problems. There are problems of gross pollution. There are the costs of maintaining the massive surveillance state. And finally, for now at least, China faces the increasing problem that with greater and greater understanding of its role in covering up the novel coronavirus that emerged from Wuhan and its worldwide disinformation campaign, so growing awareness in nations around the world, excuse me, that the Chinese Communist Party is unreliable, is not an honest partner. In the last section of the paper, Securing Freedom, we first emphasize a similarity and a difference to the Soviet Union and the Cold War. The similarity is that the Chinese Communist Party, like the Soviet Union, seeks to transform world order and seeks to place the Soviets wanted Moscow at the center, the Chinese see Beijing at the center. But a crucial difference is this: whereas the Soviets proceeded primarily by way of military power, they controlled half of Europe by dint of military force, the Chinese Communist Party proceeds primarily by way of enormous economic power, an economic power of which the Soviets could not dream. We then, after making this distinction and recognizing that the fact that economies are around the world, including that of the United States, are entwined with that of the Chinese economy, make this struggle of a different sort, we lay out a 10-point framework that represents not a concrete set of policies, but a frame in which we think the United States to formulate policies. In just 1 minute, I will say that we begin with preserving freedom at home. We move through a dedication to conserving the international order. We underscore the need for alliances and international organizations, coupled with the need to reassess them in light of the China challenge. And we conclude with an emphasis on the need for the United States to concentrate on reforming its educational system and remaining what it has been, a great champion of freedom. I'll stop there, Jacob. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter, for that lucid exposition of the main points of your paper. We will now turn to Elbridge Colby, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration, and he will now offer some remarks, I think, that may be based on a paper that he wrote and published in Foreign Affairs with another valued national interest contributor, Robert D. Kaplan. And this piece that they co-authored was called The Ideology Delusion. So Bridge has his own take on the constituent elements of the China challenge, and I welcome him now to instruct us on what he thinks.
Great. Well, thank you, Jacob, and thanks, Peter. Thanks to the Center for the invitation. I think this paper that the policy planning staff has produced is a really important, valuable. It's a great paper, very sophisticated, and I think really sets the frame for the conversation going forward very, very, very well. And so my comments are going to be really in the spirit of a sort of intramural debate, and one that I do think is important and will become increasingly important over time, especially as I think we're sort of maybe at the end of the beginning of this geopolitical competition with China, but still at a point in which significant debates and strategic decisions will have ramifications that play out for many, many years in the same way that the period of the late 1940s and early 1950s had implications for the ensuing decades. So I won't go into all the things that I vehemently and vigorously agree with in the paper and their legion. Fundamentally, most of all, that China is a fundamental and the priority challenge. The United States needs to be clear and resolute and determined in confronting it and competing with China. So, I mean, that can never be understated, especially in these times. So the question I will point to, and where I do think there's an important difference that I have, and I think Bob, I can't speak for Bob, but I'll just mention him as my collaborator in that Foreign Affairs article. And thank you for Jacob for having the generosity to host this debate despite our I don't want to say betrayal, but our wandering in the pages of Foreign Affairs. But I think the big question is how significant the role of ideology is in this competition in all its manifestations. And there are multiple vectors of this fundamental question. I think without question, ideology is important in many, many ways, not least in trying to help us explain why Beijing does what it does. I think we do need to take, and I think the paper is right, that we do need to take ideology seriously as the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic take it seriously. So it clearly motivates them in some significant way. I also think it's without question an important part of the nature of the competition, both as a driver or sort of an influencer, but also as an outcome. I mean, obviously, who ends up with the upper hand in this competition is going to be determinative in terms of what the ascendant political regimes in the world are going to look like going forward. So I think where I fundamentally disagree, I think, or materially disagree, I should say, is I think that the paper, in my view, overstates the role of ideology in China's behavior, but more importantly, in the fundamental competition as a whole. To put it very briefly, in my view, the primary challenge China poses is due to, or the primary reason China poses such a challenge is due to its size and scale. I think the paper puts it another way, which is to say China is a challenge because of its conduct. And obviously I think there's a lot to that, but conduct is contingent and somewhat ephemeral and adaptive. But the fundamental reason why I think we are concerned about China is its size and scale, and also the fact that China has very real and powerful structural incentives to establish first regional hegemony, particularly a kind of a dominant position over a large portion of the world's markets, probably most likely Asia, and to exclude or disfavor America from open access to free and open access to that market. And I think that is the core interest that China really threatens on the part of Americans. And that goes back, I know it's controversial in China circles, but the open door and even back to the black ships of the 1850s and so forth. And that would actually be true whether or not China were a democracy or run by the CCP. The challenges might be attenuated. They might be more easily addressed or managed if China were a democracy. I'm confident that's true, but I don't think they would go away. And of course, the nationalism point, I think, is especially salient here because these kinds of positions that the Chinese are taking, the PRC is taking, are very popular as far as we can tell. Obviously, there's no reliable mechanism of charting really formal Chinese public opinion, but I don't think many would argue that a lot of what Xi Jinping is doing on the national front isn't popular in wide swaths of the Chinese population. So that's where, and I think this is, I've gone back and forth with some friends on this, and some think it's really not an issue. Maybe this is sort of a parlor game or kind of an academic issue, but I'm debating an academic, so I feel like that's not necessarily insulting. I take academic and scholarly things seriously, and I think these kind of basic structural logical frameworks that we employ at the beginning will have significant ramifications, as I said later. And I see at least three, if I could, the magic rule of three, if I could boil them down. I think first is that overemphasizing ideology in the competition with China. First of all, I don't think it actually gets what the American people fundamentally need, which is open and sustained free access to the Asian market. I mean, that's our fundamental interest and our starting point, I think. But also, I think it both, in a way, understates and overstates the China challenge. I think it overstates by diminishing the potential for détente, because it suggests, and I think often there is a prudential move away from this, but logically, if the China problem would be resolved by China's transition to being a liberal democracy, then that is something that we should earnestly push for and be willing to take considerable risk because it will solve the problem. But I actually, given that I think a democracy would also pose challenges to us on these grounds, I think that is, it's both understating and overstating. It understates in the sense that it would still be a challenge, but it overstates by saying we should take more risk now than I think is actually necessary. And also, maybe in 10 years or 20 years, hopefully not 20 years, we will be in a sufficient power position, in my view, hopefully, that we should be able then to be in a position of strength to approach the Chinese and do the kind of deals and have détente in a way that I think would be favorable. But if you really think that the CCP's ideology is fundamentally inimical, I think it really makes you much more skeptical of that. The second, and I mean, I think the example here is the example of Russia, which in a sense, the USSR did what this kind of approach demands or asks for, which is collapse and try to become a democracy. And in some ways, relations with Russia, rightly or not, are worse than they were in the 1980s. Now, there could be argument about why that is. And obviously, Russia isn't a democracy, a pure democracy. But I think the point is, realistically, this should inform what we're looking for. And it suggests that the challenges are more strategic and structural than they are primarily driven by ideology. Secondly, I think overemphasizing ideology in the competition has the tendency to elevate peripheral issues and ultimately potentially entangle us. And here I think of the nightmare of Vietnam. And this is because I think the more one conceives of ideology as central to the competition, the more that any conflict or bumping together of the two sides or their proxies or their partners tends to take on the characteristics of a systemic test. And this makes, even sort of from a purely geopolitical or hard power perspective, peripheral contests take on a complexion that is much more significant. And I think this is a potential reality, especially as the Chinese are obviously getting out and about with BRI and their money, but also increasingly developing their power projection forces to be able to have more military influence. And I think, this is something where I'm concerned about the Biden team. I mean, Tony Blinken has talked a lot about a contest between techno-authoritarianism and I think and techno-democracies. And this has this kind of sense that there's two Cold War ideological camps, and how those techno-democracies fare is going to be really important for us. And that has a tendency to be a slippery slope. Third point is that I think the emphasizing ideology will make it harder to work with a pretty significant array of potential partners, and not just any potential partners, but really in a lot of respects, the most important or most salient potential partners. So I think the reality is the way that we check China's aspirations for regional hegemony are to form and sustain an anti-hegemonic coalition, primarily in Asia, designed to check China's aims. And I give the State Department, Secretary Pompeo, tremendous credit for the progress on things like the Quad. That is critical. And making sure that the regional balance, the hard power balance in Asia is right, is especially important. But this involves working with, deepening partnerships with countries throughout South and Southeast Asia that are not model democracies. In fact, there's no country, according to Freedom House, in Southeast Asia that is considered, I think, whatever, the truly free or whatever, fully free or something. And of course, India, there's a lot of controversy about its record. And this is one of the areas where I think, what former Vice President Biden's been talking about Summit of the Democracies. It's not going to do us much good if we have Denmark and Luxembourg and the Netherlands signing on to some big norms, but we basically are so emphasizing democracy and liberalism and all these things that we make it difficult to work with Vietnam, with Philippines, with Thailand, all of which are going to be issues in the coming year or so. So I think this is an area as well where overemphasizing this point is dangerous. So these are, again, the overall sort of tenor is one of fundamental agreement. But I think we all need to be, and I know I'm rowing against the tide of American natural opinion, but I think this is something where we need to check some of our impulses now, lest we get too far down this path of overemphasizing ideology. Thanks.
Bridge, thank you for that. I am surprised and gratified to see actually that your disagreements with Peter are not peripheral, but appear to me to be quite fundamental. And if I had to summarize your remarks, it seems to me you're coming much more rooted from a realist perspective, centering on power and playing down the character or the nature of the regime, which is a classic realist tenet it would apply to Iran as well, where a realist would say that even if Iran changed its government, it would still have national interests that it would pursue that were inimical to America's. Now, Peter, I think it would be very interesting if you would give us your response to Bridges' remarks about downplaying the nature of ideology. Why,
Yes.
in fact, is ideology central to the China challenge?
Happy to respond. I want to thank Bridge for the remarks. I want to raise a question as to whether Jacob is too quick to present Bridge with the crown of classical realism. It seems to me classical realism is open to the role of ideas in politics. Indeed, if memory serves, George Kennan begins his famous article on the sources of Soviet conduct with the statement that the political personality of Soviet power is a product of ideology and circumstances, ideas and interests. The key word in Bridges' analysis, much of which I agree with, is overemphasis. Bridge is absolutely right. We should avoid overemphasizing the role of ideas. That means we should give ideas their proper role. So a few, in the effort to give ideas their proper role, a couple of observations. One, it seems to me in general, we have to distinguish, as Bridge, I'm afraid, did not, between understanding ideas, that is the beliefs and assumptions that inform the conduct of a regime, and ideas in international affairs in the sense of one regime imposing its ideas on another. One can believe that to understand a pattern of conduct, you have to understand, let's say, the CCP's ideas, without believing it's incumbent upon the United States to transform the regime. Having said that, a couple of points. Yes, of course, Bridge is right that if the Bahamas adopted the ideology of the CCP, the Bahamas would not represent the kind of threat that the People's Republic of China does because of the CCP, the PRC's size and scale. Bridge is absolutely right. But there's another country in the neighborhood which also has about 1.4 billion people, which doesn't represent the kind of worldwide threat that the Chinese Communist Party does, despite its size and scale. I'm thinking of India. And it's hard for me to explain the difference between the threat that China represents and the extensive bilateral relations, which are at a kind of all-time high the United States has with India today, simply in terms of size and scale. Another point. Yes, it's true, an overemphasis on ideas can entangle us. But I want to remind everybody that at the dawn of the Cold War, Harry S. Truman proclaimed that it would be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who were resisting subjugation. The Eisenhower administration embraced the theory of the policy of containment. And yet, the Eisenhower administration incorporated into the broad American network Greece, Turkey, Portugal, Spain, from semi-authoritarian Greece to exceedingly authoritarian Spain. That is, understanding our own commitment in the United States to freedom did not confuse the United States in the 1950s about the need in foreign affairs to work with other countries that did not share fully America's principles. In the case of Spain, was not a free country, but nevertheless, we welcomed them because they shared our overarching goal of defending the free world. So I will stop there, but just remind everybody that when we speak of the role of ideas in foreign affairs, there are different senses of them. The elements of the China challenge focuses on the role of ideas in shaping the Chinese Communist Party's leadership of China. We take a much more modest view on what the role on the conduct of the United States in response. And in fact, in the final part of the paper, we do not advocate for regime change or imposing American principles on the Chinese people. We don't think we're compelled to do so in light of a goal, which is preserving the free, open, and established international order. We advocate a mix of cooperation, containment, and deterrence. Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you, Peter. That was a robust response. And I do feel obliged to note that I was not awarding Bridge the crown of realism, perhaps a few laurels, but
you were imposing the crown of thorns on me, right?
There is an interesting question about whether Peter is right, of course, that the role of ideas in recent decades perhaps has been scanted, at least in our academic departments, and that there is a classical realism. So where do you fit in there, Bridge? What's your response, Peter, when he says a mixture, when Peter says that he's returning essentially to the origins of American foreign policy after World War II, that we resist the subjugation of free peoples, but he's not calling for rollback. He's not calling for regime change. He's saying a mix of things, and I guess primarily containment. So how big are your differences in the end?
Well, we're in desperate danger of agreeing on a compromise, which leads to a boring panel. So I will keep it going. But I do think, I mean, look, I think I actually said this in a debate with Rush Doshi from Brookings after Foreign Affairs came out. I mean, I actually think it's useful. I mean, Peter is the brain of one of the big brains of the government, both personally but also institutionally in that office. So I think it's, in some ways, I think having these intellectual and structural conceptual debates is actually useful, and not coming to premature agreement, because that agreement can come in the Situation Room or whatever, or in the North Atlantic Council at the appropriate moment as statesmen or whatever making their prudent judgments. But I think for us, it's useful to kind of clarify in a policy relevant way the key issues. I mean, a couple points. I really agree. I mean, I actually would associate myself with the kind of classical realist approach, which is both focused on hard power, but as Peter, I think, absolutely rightly emphasizes, does not exclude the role of ideas, but also of honor and other kinds of, it's not in the desperate hunt for parsimoniousness as I think some of neorealism and the more novel variants of realism. And I think that's sort of. But I think I think Peter actually laid out very well the early Cold War history. I mean, I'm much more sympathetic. I think that Eisenhower versus Truman, I mean, obviously it can, coloring with broad brushes here, but I think the Eisenhower approach is much more what we should be pursuing. And I think he's right to laud, or at least point to, the role of Spain, but we could also mention the role of South Korea, South Vietnam, the Republic of China, all of which had authoritarian governments at that point, but were important for our overall effort, which is kind of eye on the prize. That, I mean, I think another way that ideology and power, kind of come together is, look, the best way to preserve freedom in the world is to make sure that we have enough power to do so. So I think that's our example. Just a couple brief things. I mean, I think his point about, and it's something that I'm not sure Bob and I explained as clearly as we might have, but I think there is a very big difference, or there's an important difference between, I think, as if I understand him correctly, understanding the role of ideas and what it means for how China will behave. And I'm much less, this is much less about that. I mean, I think there are structural issues, but more about what the role is for us and how we see and construe this competition. I mean, others would know better how Xi Jinping thinks about Marx-Leninism, but I've been pretty persuaded by people like John Garneau that it plays a pretty darn important role. So, obviously Lenin had an appreciation for power, so they're realists in a way as well. But I think that's a very valid point. Sometimes gets lost. Just on India, I mean, I actually think that it's kind of more in my column, because I mean, I think it's explained by the fact that India, while a very large country in population, is much smaller, both in current sort of GDP and military power, as well as the plausible trajectory. And we share a prioritization of the China threat increasingly, and I think that explains it. And I think the fact that India, while being a parliamentary democracy during the Cold War after independence, was much more aligned with the USSR, kind of goes to that point. And so, I mean, just a concluding thought is, and I think I'd be interested to see what Peter thinks, although I know we're going to questions, is, I mean, in a way, I think, balance of power gets thinking and gets more of a hard knock in its compatibility with the American experiment than I think it deserves. Still current Attorney General Barr, I thought, had a really, really interesting and penetrating point in a speech a couple months ago, where he said the central aspect of the American Constitution is not the Bill of Rights, but the separation of powers. And in a sense, I think I'm just talking, I think balance of power in this way that has an appreciation for the role of ideas, that is moral, that is seeking to preserve and promote American freedom, and where we can, in an enlightened way, others' freedom abroad. But that is actually the heart of the American Constitution, more than declarations of human rights, which I know will be a provocation. Well, maybe not the Center for the National Interest, but to some. So anyway, I think what I'm saying is also compatible with American political tradition. Thanks.
Well, we have a welter of questions, so I'm going to forego the moderator's prerogative. I'm not going to ask a question myself. The first one, a very good question from Paul Hare of the Center for the National Interest. He asks to both Bridge and Peter, do the speakers agree on China's global ambition? Notwithstanding the ideological competition, the documentary and historical record does not support the assertion that China seeks global hegemony. In fact, Paul says that the policy planning staff paper attributes this goal to a 2013 speech by Xi Jinping, in which he refers to China winning the, quote, dominant position, unquote. But Paul says this is a debatable interpretation of an inaccurate translation. In Paul's view, China seeks largely to maximize its wealth and power and influence within the existing order, but in peaceful coexistence with democracy and capitalism. In other words, I think he's saying it's not a revisionist power. Peter?
I think it's, I appreciate the question, but it's deeply misleading to attribute the policy planning staff's thesis to that one sentence from the one speech, however well or poorly translated. The longest section of our paper, section 2, deals with China's conduct, in which we document brazen schemes of co-optation and coercion in every region of the world, starting with the Indo-Pacific, proceeding outward. We show how China uses intellectual property theft, the commandeering of supply lines, the quest for industrial dominance, the quest to become the 5G provider of choice around the world, the bridge and road initiative, and China's efforts to impose its own culture on other peoples through, say, Confucius Institutes, not only at American universities, at other universities. It was this pattern of conduct combined with the ideas that leads us to the conclusion, along with China's efforts within international organizations, which we discuss and document, to insert into them new norms, new standards. So really, our argument doesn't depend upon an inference from ideas. We are not idealists in that old and discredited sense. Rather, once again, we understand that to understand the conduct of states, one has to look at the interaction of ideas and interests. For us, and by the way, we draw upon a number of speeches going all the way back to Mao and show the consistency. Those speeches and writings of the Chinese Communist Party make sense of these very dramatic patterns of conduct. So our argument is rooted in Chinese conduct.
Thank you, Peter. Bridge, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, the first one, Paul here obviously has a very, very different view. I mean, I don't know how one can actually think that China is not seeking a predominant position, at least in the Asia Pacific. I mean, it just strains credulity. I mean, whatever Xi Jinping is saying, frankly, and I think my point of view is that I don't know what they're saying, but the structural incentives are such that goes in their, they're going to go in that direction. And honestly, I mean, it's sort of every day they come up with a new example. I mean, beyond what could even be conceivable a couple of years ago of how domineering and ambitious they appear to be. Now, the question of whether they want to be globally preeminent, well, actually, I was in sort of a debate with Jake Sullivan and Hal Brands about this in the page of yet another journal, Foreign Policy, this one. So sorry, Jacob, to try your patience. But I mean, I think about whether China's ambitions are truly global. I tend to focus on their regional ambition, because I think if they're dominant in Asia, then they will be in a position to be globally preeminent, and that's the main theater. So I think, basically I agree with Peter here.
Bridge, it sounds to me like you've been quite promiscuous in your publications, and you owe the national interest.
I know. Got to get back to the basics.
Our next question comes from Edward Grant of the Japan American Society, a succinct follow-on to Paul's. Do both speakers believe that we have already entered into a new Cold War? Peter?
Well, I don't like the term Cold War because it suggests the identity of this struggle with the previous struggle. As you know, I already distinguished between the struggles. On the one hand, it seems to me the same political good is at stake. Freedom. What kind of international order are we going to live under? Is it one that favors free and sovereign nation states and is grounded in human rights and the rule of law? Or is it one that is shaped by the interests of the Chinese Communist Party and therefore supports an authoritarian sensibility? So that was at stake during the Cold War. I believe it's at stake again. But this is a very different sort of struggle because of the tremendous power of the Chinese economy, the lure of a potential market of 1.4 million people in China, and because all major economies, including that of the United States, are already deeply entangled, so that any approach, it seems to me, any responsible approach to the China challenge is going to involve a complex mix of seeking opportunities for cooperation, based, of course, on norms of fairness and reciprocity, along with, where necessary, containment and deterrence.
Bridge.
Yeah, I don't like the term Cold War either for the reasons that Peter said. I would just say, look, we can be frank and candid and direct now that we are in a long-term sustained competition and that it is going to be confrontational, and then marshal the power and position to be in a place where we can have détente. So we can do that now, or we can do it later on much less favorable and propitious grounds, and in which the chance of conflict are much worse. I mean, I think, I participated in the national defense strategy and to a lesser degree on the national security strategy. A big part of what we were thinking was, let's get ahead of, well, frankly, we're already behind, but let's get ahead of this so that we can be in a better position later. The system is already blinking red, so let's make sure that we don't get to a place where dramatically bad outcomes happen, or we have to restore things that we've already lost. So I think, to me, the spirit of the question, if I'm not being unfair, I think if put to it, it's better to think that way than to think the other way.
We have another terse question, but pointed, from Joseph Bosco, who actually wrote an opinion piece for the National Interest in explaining why he was voting for Trump before the election. And as I recall, it centered on Trump's vigorous China policy. He asks, isn't the Chinese Communist Party's merging of ideology and nationalism reminiscent of what happened in Germany under the Nazis, Mussolini in Italy, and the Soviets in Russia? Peter?
It certainly is, and I am happy to report that one of the inspirations from the paper was a fresh reading I did of George Kennan's analysis of the Soviet challenge shortly after being appointed head of policy planning, and where I learned or relearned that Kennan's own argument about the sources of Soviet conduct is that, as we've already said, a combination of ideology and circumstances, but the ideas themselves are a strange mix. He speaks of a neurotic view of the world, which arises as a result of the strange mixing of Marxism, Leninism, and Russian nationalism. What may seem inconsistent on paper, nevertheless may blend together in the sensibility of political parties and The Chinese Communist Party sensibility is different. It's similar in that it's a blending, once again, of nationalism and Marxism, Leninism. It's different, though, because Chinese nationalism differs from Russian nationalism.
Bridge, what's your view?
Well, maybe go to the next question. I know we've got a whole bunch and not so much time left.
That's fine. I'm going to pursue a question to Peter, and I suppose Bridge may be interested in it as well. One of the things that's interesting about Kennan is first he sent the long telegram, which was the initial wake-up call to Washington, D.C., and it detonated with concussive force, where our World War II policy had been one of an alliance with the Soviet Union. The American public was not really prepared for the idea that we would enter upon confrontation. And Kennan wrote the long telegram in a spirit of vexation and mental anguish, and he, someone amusedly notes that he strained the resources of the State Department by sending, such a long telegram. That was then followed. Then it was James Forrestal, who was head of the, I don't even know if it was called Pentagon by then, the War Department. And Forrestal pushed Kennan on the X article, which appeared in Foreign Affairs, the magazine we keep mentioning today, in 1947. Kennan, being a divided soul, sort of recoiled for the impact of that article. He was berated by Walter Lippmann, a staunch realist, for ascribing too much ideology to the Soviet Union. And Kennan spent much of the rest of his life, in a way, backtracking from that article. So, Peter, when you go back to Kennan, how comfortable do you actually feel in that your paper is an accurate representation of the kind of thinking that he would embrace? My guess is that the Kennan of later years would say that we should, in fact, not exaggerate the Chinese challenge, that we could arrive at a détente with them, that we don't need to, and the main thing he always warned against was over-militarizing conflicts. So yeah. What's your response to that?
First, excellent question. Second, my understanding is that over the years, what Kennan sought to distance himself from was not so much his own writings, but the practices, the theory of containment that followed upon his writings. And if one returns to the long telegram, first of all, as you know, one doesn't find the word containment in it. And indeed, the long telegram is an analysis of the problem. To the extent that it sets forward a response, it actually concentrates in the very short final section on the United States' need to make sure its own house is in order, to ensure that that there is political concord at home, that citizens share a cohesive, strong, firm political commitment to American principles. And generally, and for the most part, the X article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, that follows fast on its heels, is of the same sort. There are a few sentences about containment, but hardly a theory of containment. And by the way, in the conclusion of The Sources of Soviet Conduct, the longer piece of writing, Kennan reaches the same conclusion: to prevail in the struggle against the Soviet Union, what America must above all do, he argues in the final lines, is return to its great conditions and act in the ways that are appropriate for the greatness of the nation. By greatness of the nation, again, I believe he meant political traditions of freedom, self-government, equality under law. So yes, Kennan over the years expressed discontent with the concrete foreign policy that was developed, but turning now to our reading of Kennan today. What we took from Kennan's writings: one, pay attention to the combination, the complex interaction of ideas and circumstances or interests. Pay attention to how in ideas, nationalism and communism may interact, and understand how deeply rooted successful foreign policy is in a strong political order at home, revolving around freedom. I see no need to revise those ideas. In fact, I commend them to all.
Bridge?
Well, I mean, Kennan is a mixed bag, obviously. So, and I mean, I think his judgment, in some ways, he blinked from the consequences of judgment. So I think the military, Kennan, I think, was in favor of the demilitarization of Germany, which probably would have been a disastrous policy, if I recall. But I mean, the argument actually I had in mind, and Bob and I actually refer to it, the piece that we're tilting against more is NSC 68, which is more, is Paul Nitze and one of Peter's predecessors, Kennan's successor, is much more of a systemic, ideological, almost a fight to the death. Now, I mean, I think Ashton's comment about it was designed to bludgeon the mass mind of government. So, I fully appreciate that reality, having been, part of the mass mind from time to time. But I think our spirit is my spirit certainly would be much more in line, I would try, with Eisenhower, which is an appreciation of hard power and the ideological part, but with more of an eye towards selectivity, not in a way of Kennan, which sort of blinked from, I think, the consequences of what he was advocating and the necessity of the Cold War, but of, not getting into Vietnam and making alliances and partnerships, even with countries whose political regime or behavior we might find opprobrious in certain ways.
Peter, I'll just ask you one quick follow-up on Kennan, since this is triggering all kinds of thoughts. Kennan's big fear throughout his life was a repetition of World War I, which is kind of interesting because he actually experienced World War II in Germany and was interned as a diplomat. But World War I was his big bugaboo. The idea that the great powers could inadvertently slide into a calamitous conflict that would destroy them, and that they had never had any intention of embarking upon. That in fact, by taking too aggressive a stance, you can unwittingly create the conditions for the conflict you want to avoid. So it prompts me to ask you, what, if any, engagement would you espouse with China?
Well, as our paper underscores, we believe the United States should actually seek out opportunities for cooperation, but we equally underscore that cooperation, commerce and trade, needs to be conducted not on the basis of thuggery, dishonesty, hypocrisy that characterizes so much of the CCP's conduct abroad, but on the basis of the norms that are inscribed, already inscribed in the free and open rules-based international order, norms of fairness and reciprocity. Now, there's no guarantee of success, but we are also acutely aware of all the dangers. We recognize, as I've already mentioned, the entanglement of economies. That's not going to end anytime soon, but we hope, both working together as we have, for example, with the Clean Network, as we have by revamping international organizations for investment in countries around the world, we hope to compete more effectively with China in the arena that they've really chosen for primary competition, the economic arena.
Well, we have a good question from former Undersecretary. Oh, you want to jump in, Bridge?
Well, just briefly, because I think this is also an important Chinese talking point. I mean, I think, World War I will captivate historians and, just people in general for centuries, if not longer. And so it, it's complex, obviously, an unutterable tragedy. But I think I think it's become normed, and the Chinese use this as the product of excessively aggressive behavior. And that is true in certain respects, certainly on the part of Berlin and Vienna, maybe Moscow. But it's also the product of insufficient determination and clarity, in particular on the part of London. And if London had a clearer position on a German invasion, certainly of Belgium and France and so forth, and even better, of deployed force on the continent, as they were beginning to probably start to move towards, Berlin's calculus might have been different. And this is especially important because I think that is probably the scenario that's most analogous in the Western Pacific, where particularly over Taiwan, we have a situation of ambiguity. So the Chinese know that we are very, very powerful, but they're not clear that we would actually come and that they might be able to wrap it up in time, which was in a sense Berlin's assessment over the behavior of Great Britain.
Well, we have a good question from former Undersecretary of Defense Walt Slocum. And Walt asks, he says, Bridges' argument for non-ideological alliances as a counterpart in the questions of Chinese vulnerability. One of Beijing's weaknesses, not on Peter Berkowitz's list, is the deep distrust of China among most of its neighbors. Why don't you respond to that first, Bridge, and then we'll have Peter.
Hey, Walt, thanks. Great question. And I mean, I could ask you that question, but I would say this actually points to the importance of moderating the ideological element. And I think Peter is on the same page here. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I mean, fundamentally, if we look at the countries that want to work with us the most, not necessarily that are treaty allies like a Luxembourg or an Iceland or whatever, but are actually interested in doing things with doing things that blunt China's aggressiveness and actually even get in fights with the Chinese, they're countries that neighbor China: India, Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the countries that really mean, and not all of them are model democracies. So I think here I don't want to go overboard. We should stand for our values on its own sake, but also because it's useful. But I think we definitely need to, this techno-authoritarian, techno-democracy thing, it has this ring of ideologizing everything. And I'm just very concerned that we're going to get to a point where it's like, well, Duterte is a bad guy. And, the guys in Hanoi are no good. And there's a military government running Thailand, and we're of the techno-democracies. So I guess we can't work with them. And suddenly we're left with, the Germans, and frankly, the fact that the French are willing to sail their aircraft carrier every once in a while to the Pacific, it's nice, but it doesn't change the balance of power. And my last point, actually, and the last thing I didn't get to, sorry, but it's relevant, is I think the lesson of World War I here, and this gets to the point here, is don't give the Chinese an opening. Make sure that the balance of power is not too delicate. Make sure it's not a close call for them. And I'm very concerned that right now we're in a close call world.
Peter.
First, the distrust of China's neighbors of China is sort of on our list. Both generally, we point out the difficulty of authoritarian powers maintaining friends and alliances, and also we emphasize the distrust around the world generated by China's misconduct, global pandemic. Second, concerning working with imperfect democracies or even non-democracies, I agree with Bridge. It would be a mistake, especially a mistake if you argued from the basis of ideas, to exclude cooperation with imperfect democracies, non-democracies in our competition with China. One must always keep the overarching goal in view. The overarching goal is the defense of freedom at home, which we link to the defense of a free, open, rules-based international order. In defending that order, the United States may have to, like all great powers before it in history, work with other nation states whose commitment to justice is imperfect. This is not a novel problem in foreign affairs. In fact, it's the oldest problem in foreign affairs. and we need competent and judicious statesmen and stateswomen to steer us through those complexities.
We have one final question for both of you, and it's a doozy. It is. There is a lot of talk that I'm hearing in Washington now that China is going to raise the stakes sharply on Taiwan. And the Center's General Chip Gregson says, China is indeed a stern test for US policy, and it looks like it's the next target. What's your recommendation for our policy towards Taiwan? Peter?
Jacob, I'm sorry to tell you that I'm going to refrain from recommending a concrete policy on Taiwan beyond what is the United States policy, that we respect Taiwan, we respect its freedom. As you know, we have supplied Taiwan with more weapons and more enhanced weapons, and we will continue to watch carefully. And we're committed to the policy that the status quo should only be changed through negotiations.
Thank you. Bridge?
Yes, and if I could, Peter, I would just add maybe that the standing policy remains that the United States would regard the use of force to resolve the issue as a matter of grave concern, which I think you touched on last, but I mean, just so since we're on video here, I will take
Indeed, thank you.
Chip, great to hear from you. I mean, you would know this better than anybody. I mean, I think I would be more clear. I think there's twofold. I think a couplefold. One, the problem is very severe, and I agree with you that Taiwan is China's best target for a variety of reasons. It's militarily proximate, and the PLA has developed its capacity to go after Taiwan. It's a fraught and ambiguous political issue, given the the kind of disputed status of Taiwan and so forth. So it's there, and I actually think it's more attractive, not just for its own sake, given China's revanchist ambitions towards Taiwan, but also because it does implicate U.S. credibility in this sort of a little bit speaking out of both sides of our mouth, not you personally, Peter, but just we as a country over time. But I think as Chip, as you know, as well as anyone, I think most people in Asia, certainly most people in governments in Asia, regard Taiwan as a bellwether, as a canary in the coal mine for how the United States would treat its security commitments otherwise. So in this context, I think I would break the problem into two pieces. One is China should have no doubt in my mind that the United States would come to Taiwan's aid. And that's, I think that is insufficiently clear. And I think we should be clear on that particular point. And some of the debates over strategic ambiguity, one of the key points that I do think has come out of this has been general agreement that Americans should be prepared to come to Taiwan's aid. Of course, in the event, that's going to be a decision by the president and the Congress and so forth. But I think China should have no doubt. And this gets back to that World War I problem, not to mention Korea 1950, not to mention Kuwait 1990. Secondly, our position on the political status of Taiwan, my view is we should remain more ambiguous. I'm not convinced that at this point, it's advisable for us to change our policy on the political orientation. But as you know, and you worked on this, I worked on this in my time. I believe this is what the Department of Defense should be above all. And I have a book coming out about this next year. So you can listen to me at much greater length if that's your poison. But above all, the Department of Defense, the Joint Force should be a size, shaped, readied, and postured to defeat a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, particularly a fait accompli attempt, which I think is the most dangerous. I'm not so persuaded that Beijing would go for a kind of a salami slicing, would go after one of the offshore islands or mount a kind of a massive cyber attack. I think China's best strategy would be to go big or go home and basically present a new reality. And I think we're under many, not you and not us on the panel probably, but I think many Americans discount this possibility. So I think this is what keeps me up at night. But I think if I want to leave a message to our friends in Beijing, I do feel that the American people and their leaders would back defensive action to defend Taiwan, and that even those who would counsel backing down would find it politically untenable to do so.
Well, thank you both. I first met Peter when we were at Harvard, and he in his academic incarnation, and I'm pleased to see that today's session has again ratified that he has supremely mastered his role as government official. And I would also like to thank Bridge for a edifying and provocative conversation. Thank you all for listening, and that ends today's session.
Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Peter.